Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life, the radio show and podcast that brings you inspiring people with visions of a viable future for life on Earth that includes humans. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of Paradigms. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad to be here with you, bringing you a couple of guests who are doing some really interesting musical work, composing and playing live music for silent films. And they're going to tell us about the films and how they got to do this. I think you'll find it fascinating, and I think you'll want to see the films. So let's get right to it and meet my guests right now on this episode of Paradigms. Alicia Svigals and Donald Sosin, welcome to Paradigms.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks.
You have been working together scoring these silent films that come out of the early 20th century related to what was happening with Jews at that time of the world. It's really an amazing project. You've got a number of films you've done. I'd like to know, firstly, just a bit about each of you, how you came to music, how you came to this project, because it's so powerful, and also why this is so relevant right now.
I've been playing the violin since I was 5 years old. I was classically trained, but I started getting into different kinds of ethnic music as a teenager and landed in Klezmer music, which is the music of my ancestry, traditional Eastern European Jewish folk music. I perform and write in the genre, and I've been co-writing the silent film scores with Donald. I started out writing my own silent film score, the first one called The Yellow Ticket, a 1918 film, which I performed with a pianist named Marilyn Lerner. And Donnie saw us do that performance at a silent film festival in Italy and invited me to join his projects, which have been the last 3 films.
Well, I grew up studying piano and then composition in college in Michigan and Columbia, and did a lot of work in the theater in New York. But even while I was a student at Michigan, I started playing for silent films as just a little sideline to my other activities. And that led to working in New York professionally at the Museum of Modern Art and Lincoln Center and the Guggenheim, the Museum of the Moving Image. And from there, it's spread all over the world to other film festivals, other archives, and recordings for a bunch of different production companies. So that's the silent film end of it. And I have also had a career as a conductor in the theater and pianist, and working with my wife, who's a singer and a lyricist and an actress. And we've put out an album of Broadway songs and done a fair amount of songs for silent films, which is quite unusual. We don't know of anybody else in the world that has any body of work that is songs for silent films, in addition to finding period songs that are sometimes required by the films because the lyrics are shown on screen or somebody's singing, and then you find out what they're singing from hiring a lip reader. So it's an interesting melange of different activities, and silent films is not something that I ever thought I would spend a lot of time doing, but now it's really occupies quite a lot of my time.
In terms of what makes this particular film, we have 3 of them: The Ancient Law, City Without Jews, and Man Without a World. We were talking about City Without Jews, which you viewed. This is a film about a fictional city. And by the way, the film is from 1924, a fictional city which is supposed to resemble Vienna, and which is satirically called Utopia because the film is a dystopia, where the Jews are expelled en masse. It's an interesting film because it's a tragedy, but it's also a satire, a biting satire, and so it's also a comedy. But there are wrenching depictions of what an expulsion of a whole population looks like, and in particular, what it looks like, what it feels like, the inner emotional world of the people who are being displaced, which is not what you get usually from reading the newspapers. And this is a tragedy that's happening all over the world all the time. And now, as we speak, but news accounts, political debates, none of this capture the human dimension. And watching a film like this, even though it was made 100 years ago, does just that. And we wrote music that we hoped would bring that out in the experience of the viewer listener.
The music is very poignant, and the film is. And as you say, it brings you into the experience because it's visual. You see faces and emotion.
And we feel that it's important to bring the Jewish aspect of the music into the film. There are other scores for all kinds of Jewish films that basically ignore the idea that these are Jews with a cultural heritage in which music plays a very large and important part, starting in the home with folk songs and in the synagogue with a long history of tunes that go back to the Middle Ages even. And so we've put much of that content and the feeling of that music into the film, into all three of the films that we've done so far. The audiences respond very deeply to that, because if they've grown up in Jewish households and gone to synagogues, then that music is really part of their whole being, as it is with mine, as it is with Alicia.
And then if they haven't and it's new to them, it's a really intimate, powerful, deep, and emotional introduction to that culture. And this is a sort of approach that I came up with in my education, both Jewishly and musically, as a Yiddishist. I went to the Workman Circle School as a child and I learned Yiddish. And then when I was starting to spearhead the Klezmer revival of the 1980s, 1990s, I had a day job working at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And their philosophy generally, and many other klezmer musicians did too, it was sort of an incubator of the whole klezmer revival world. But the YIVO philosophy about Yiddish culture in general was that what's important is to focus on how Jews lived and live more than how Jews died. And in American Jewish culture, there's a lot of focus on the trauma of the Holocaust, and there's at the same time a tendency to forget and bypass that the history of Eastern European Jews isn't just about death and suffering. It's about language, literature, folkways, folklore, and for us, above all, music, a living, vibrant culture that continues to this day. So I think that also ends up in the score to the film, that it's not just about repeating to each other and to the world, what's necessary, which is to remember, crimes against humanity, but to, valorize and savor the culture and the people, and to keep that going.
You're listening to my conversation with Alicia Svigals and Donald Sosin, who are working together, composing and performing music for silent films, specifically films from the early 20th century that relate to Jewish life in Europe. These are relevant historically, artistically, and in today's political climate, they speak to the human condition. We'll be back with more of this conversation, but let's hear some of the music that these folks are creating. We're going to start out with a couple of pieces, one from Donald and one from Alicia, and then we'll be back with more conversation. This one's called Looney Lens, Pas de Deux by Donald Sosin. You're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life. You just heard Dawn Reprise from Alicia Svigals, and we heard Donald Sosin's piece, Looney Lens, Pas de Deux, before then. Wonderful music, right? Now let's hear the next part of my conversation with Donald Sosin and Alicia Svigals. Partaking of anything from any culture, we get to taste some of it, the music, the food, the language, all of that. So for folks who aren't familiar with Judaica in any way, with Judaism, with klezmer music, this is a way to experience another culture. And the more we do that, I think the better off humanity is. So just from a cross-cultural point of view, it's so important. But as a Jewish person, it's affirming. And I love what you said, Alicia. It's not just about how Jews die. It's about how we live. And it's so important. You know, klezmer music generally is pretty up and fun. And it's about enjoying and dancing and even comedy and, you know, that part of the human condition. And so it's not just all about the heaviness. So I appreciate that. And yet at the same time, here we are at this time in the world where I guess the new term they use is ethnic cleansing. That's been around for a couple of decades, and it happens, and it is happening, and it isn't always reported or called that, depending on, you know, who's reporting and who's in power, and, you know, the victor tells the story and all that stuff. So this is such important cultural media for us as humans. Tell me a bit about what it's like for you to watch a film, and then how does the music come to you when you're working with the message of what you're seeing?
We start by watching the film in silence. And since both of us have music running through our heads all the time, it's just this intuitive reaction to the film. For myself, after doing this for over 50 years, the music just kind of starts getting created in my mind. And then if I am watching the film and I have my keyboard there, which is frequent, then I might just start pressing record and start messing around with different ideas and using that as a sketchbook.
And I tend to walk down the street or walk my dog in the park, singing to myself and watching the characters in my mind's eye. And then I, press record on my phone and sing.
Yeah, or in my car, I'm always saying, Siri, turn on voice memos, and then I'm listening to all the sounds of the traffic, and somewhere in the middle of that is me going. Then that gets refined over however long we have. Each one of these scores has had its own process. City with Jews, we wrote in different spaces entirely because it was during the pandemic. So I would write ideas and send them to Alicia, and she would write ideas, play ideas, and record them and send them back to me, and then put them together in our apps and figure out how the timings would work with matching her tunes to the length of whatever the scenes were, or me creating an accompaniment to a tune, or sending her an accompaniment and saying, can you play something over this? It was every possible way of combining our different musical styles and instruments we did.
When we watch and play, or watch and compose, both, we're really following the image and the physical gestures of the characters and kind of the tempo of their movements. And so the music becomes very integrated with the film because their gestures are practically conducting us as we play in many spots. Either we'll write it that way and reproduce it, or just the way we play and interpret. If we have our eyes on the film, I can have my eyes on the film more because I don't have as many notes to play as a pianist. But we can let the figures on screen conduct us, which is fun.
Sometimes we are actually improvising to the film. In City Without Jews, there's some long solo violin passages, and Alicia is playing these beautiful melismatic Jewish melodies. Are those mostly just you're making them up on the spot when you're doing those?
Well, in City Without Shoes, I based the cantorial style music on the beginning of a prayer of a cantorial piece called Hineni, Here I Am, or Here We Are. And, as the people who are being expelled are throwing their hands up to the heavens and addressing God, I'm doing the musical phrase, Here We Are. There's a particular famous cantorial recording of that. I outlined it. I outlined the modal changes for it, and then just as the cantor does, I improvise on the series of modal modulations. And so the composition it's like a series of chord changes in Western music, but instead it's a series of scale changes. I know I'm getting into the weeds for listeners musically, but that's one method of composing in Jewish music, and that's what I did for those.
It's a very interesting conversation. We'll be back with more of it after we hear a piece by Alicia Svigals called Conversations with a Rebbe, which is another word for rabbi. Conversations with a Rebbe. That's Alicia Svigals. What a player and composer she is. Really something. And I hope you're enjoying the conversation with Alicia and Donald, because they're both pretty inspired people. We're going to hear some more conversation, and then we'll be back with some music from the movie City Without Jews. The message in the work that you're doing relates so much to what's happening in the world, and we see so much, I keep saying the phrase so much, pain and suffering and oppression happening and authoritarianism rising. And these patterns, we've seen them before. We've already done this dance. We've seen this movie, literally. And yet here we find ourselves again as humanity. How do you deal with it? What are your thoughts about it? How do you console yourself? How do you celebrate in the face of what a painful world it is in so many ways right now?
It is a painful world, and partly it's because we're at this weird place as a species where we're so connected to the whole world. I mean, there were always terrible times everywhere. I mean, we've been through world wars and depressions, but now it's like there's this world consciousness of it all through media, the internet. And, it's so hard, especially for young people. You're kind of, it's like synesthesia again. If you're a sensitive person, you're vibrating to the suffering of billions, So that's a tough one for everybody. And I think everybody's trying to figure that one out. But, it's hard because the problems are systemic problems. Take, to leave music and the film for a second, take climate change. Like all you can do as an individual is recycle, but that's not going to do a thing in a way. Is it like a shamanic gesture at this point? It's such a giant systemic problem that requires political and economic solutions for everybody to believe that, it's up to them to, be good recyclers. So it's very hard. For me, it's like all I can do is exude as much kindness as I can out into the world on a one-to-one basis, tamp down my more selfish impulses, have a loving thought or gesture to the people I encounter briefly and in a more prolonged way, and make art and bring happiness into people's lives. I'm the tiniest cog in a wheel, and I could try to be as politically involved as I want. I'm still one person. It's levitation, the game of levitation we used to do in summer camp, where everybody puts one finger underneath somebody who's lying down, and everybody and nobody is lifting them. And I guess that's what recycling is. It's spreading kindness is that too. So everybody has to do that. It's like voting. Everybody has to vote, or there's no democracy, even though your vote, on its own doesn't do a thing. So that's like an eternal paradox and conundrum. And, I do my part and I try to be part of the solution. And I do that through playing and writing music because that's nourishing to people. And I hope that's a gift that I'm giving people.
Long ago, I started writing healing music and would give little concerts where people could just sit and be quiet and listen to something that was soothing. And now I have a number of pieces that are online that people can listen to, like 3 or 4 minute piano pieces. On a more subtle level, it's funny that Alicia mentioned levitation, because since the 70s, I've been practicing the transcendental meditation technique, and there are advanced programs which include yogic flying, in which the body starts trying to lift off the ground. We have a technique which impels the body to become light and to lift off the ground. So in our kind of coarse state, this doesn't happen very often, but I've been on large TM courses in Iowa and Israel where people are hopping around on pieces of foam. And the purpose of doing this is not for the outward experience of moving the body around, but for what happens in the brain when many people gather together to meditate at the same time. And there have been studies on this that go back to the 70s and are funded by the National Institute of Health, which show that when you have the square root of 1% of a population, whether it's a city or a country meditating, or the whole world for that matter, meditating in groups, or even we're hooked up these days on Zoom doing our practice at the same time. There is a very powerful effect in the environment that is based on the fact that these techniques produce a massive amount of brainwave coherence. And when a system is orderly, things in the environment start to quiet down. So this has been measured in terms of lower deaths in wars in Lebanon, even though the people meditating were in the US. Accident and sickness rates, hospital admissions, crime, all go down when there are these groups of people meditating. And so I feel that for my part, the best thing that I can do is close my eyes twice a day, not to remove myself from what's going on in the world, which is painful and requires attention and compassion, but that it's connecting me on the deepest possible level with the level that we all are part of, which is the silence out of which all of these vibrations that we were talking about arise. My experience is that the music that I'm making becomes more deep and more personal as I continue to meditate, and that it seems to be affecting more and more people in a positive way. And so I'm very grateful to have that as part of my daily practice. And then the music as an outward manifestation of what's going on internally.
All right, we'll be back with more of this conversation after we hear this piece. This is from the City Without Jews film, music composed by Alicia Svigals and Donald Sosin. This piece is called Expulsion. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life. Very poignant music. I don't know about you, but I really feel it in my body as I listen to it. And if you watch the film, it's even more powerful. That was from the City Without Jews soundtrack, Donald Sosin and Alicia Svigals. Here's the next part of my conversation with Donald and Alicia.
I'll tell you a little story. My grandfather, who grew up in Austria and became a cantor and was a cantor his whole life, but when he went to school, yeshiva, as a child, was considered this amazing prodigy. And they used to play games where they would play games levitating Nathan in the school and levitating the table that he was on. And, it was a thing.
Oh,
so
amazing. Are there recordings of him?
In fact, my family has just assembled a bunch of recordings. They were all in Yiddish, and they've been translated. And so we have this. And
of his singing?
Of his singing, of his telling his life story. It's an amazing thing. And, everyone, no matter what culture you come from, you have ancestors who did amazing things. We are all descended from people who lived, who survived hardship, and who were creative and made amazing things happen and were part of the world. And it's important, I think, to remember and invoke that. And I think that's part of what your work is in this context, certainly, and everything else you're both doing is invoking the nourishment from the past, and also, yes, the pain from the past, but how does that also allow us to grow?
I like to think also about how we will one day be the ancestors, both whether, spiritually or physically, but we are the ancestors of the future.
Yes, so what we do now, we are handing down to those who come after us. People will stand on our shoulders as we stand on others.
Right.
Right. And part of my work as a musician is teaching young people how to write silent film music. I've done this with college kids out in Denver and a couple of other campuses. And then I'm part of a group at the Pordenone, Italy Silent Film Festival every October, which is where Alicia and I met, where there are usually 2 young people that come in every year for the week-long festival, and about 9 or 10 of us who are older and presumably a bit more experienced, if not wiser, sit them down at a piano and throw some films up on the screen and say, go, play. And it's daunting, but by the end of 5 days, 2 hours a day, they've really started thinking more deeply, and they come in as good musicians, and they go out as more qualified silent film musicians. Nowadays, you can't study this in a college curriculum, but in the day, in the 20s, you could go to the Eastman School of Music and specialize in silent film accompaniment. There was a whole major.
I did not know that. Speaking of ancestors, I love to tell the story about how when I wrote the music for that first silent film I did, The Yellow Ticket, my father told me, when I told him about the project, he told me that that's how my grandparents met. My grandfather was a pianist for silent films in Manhattan, exactly a block from where our apartment is now. And she would come watch the films, and they met and got married. And eventually I was born.
And my grandmother, who was born in London, came to the States in the early 20th century, and she was in a silent film in 1911, which seems to have disappeared. There are little notices in the trade papers of the time for a film that my dad remembered was called The Gang Leaders Reform. And probably it's gone, along with 80% of all the silent films ever made, just gone into the ozone.
But here you are both carrying on your family's businesses.
My grandfather on my mother's side ran a music store. And so he was selling phonographs and then later TVs. So we were making records at home when I was 5 years old. He would bring a record making machine, and we would have little musicals. And I was sometimes the master of ceremony and sing, and now Daddy's coming.
Well, that's really cute. Do you still have those recordings?
I do, yes.
Well, I love what you're both doing and what you're bringing to it in terms of intention and care. It's a beautiful thing. And what you said, Alicia, about, there are always, it's always a terrible time. There's always terrible things happening. And we are so directed to focus on the terrible. Also, I want to, admit that it has an effect. And sometimes we need to turn away from the terrible on purpose just to refresh our spirit.
Starting in 1975, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi said, we're in the age of enlightenment. I don't know how much you know about that part of it. But he said that from his standpoint, and he was presumably an enlightened person, that the world was entering a golden age. I mean, other people have said this is the age of Aquarius and stuff. So you look around and you say, well, where is it already? Why isn't it here? And there's still a lot of stress in the world, but the press doesn't report all the good stuff that's going on. The press doesn't make money doing that. They have never done that. But in fact, there's enormous amounts of good stuff. As Alicia said, we're all connected now. And there's less poverty in the world, there's less crime in the world than there used to be, even though there are these pockets of horror and idiots running various governments. But as things progress, Maharishi also said that government is an innocent mirror of the consciousness of the people. And so if we have more and more people who are focused on doing meditation or just simply being kind to each other, that's going to have a wave effect that will send out little vibrations so that things will continue to change. I sometimes feel like we're in the middle of this gigantic cell which is dividing. We have all this negativity on one side, but there's all this positivity too. And eventually the negativity is just going to break away and you can choose which side you want to be on.
We'll be back with the final part of my conversation with Donald Sosin and Alicia Svigals, but first we're going to hear some more music. This is a piece by Donald Sosin that he created with his wife, Joanna Seaton. It's called East Side, West Side.
City of dreams, city of dreamers, always alive, always awake, always aglow. City of stone, never completed, never too high, never too proud, eager to grow. City made of miracles, there's a new one every day. City of love, city worth loving, opening hearts, making us real, more than its parts, sidewalk and steel, keeping us free, the city of our dreams. City of stone, never completed, opening hearts, making us real, more than its parts, sidewalk and steel, keeping us free, the city of our dreams.
we just heard a piece by Alicia Svigals called Pashtunts, and before that, Donald Sosin and Joanna Seaton, East Side, West Side. And now let's hear the final part of my conversation with Donald Sosin and Alicia Svigals.
We have 3 films, and, as Donnie mentioned, silent films are an artistic treasure, which are mostly lost to us. So the 20% we have left are really gems that people should see. So our first film is called The Ancient Law. It's from 1923, and it's about the son of a rabbi who runs off to Vienna to become an actor. So you should definitely see that, Baruch. And his name is Baruch. On April 18th, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, we're performing City Without Jews at the FDR Presidential Library. Our third film is called Man Without a World, and it's really interesting because it's a fictional silent film, meaning it's purportedly, the conceit of the film is that it's a 1920s silent film by a Soviet Jewish director, but it was actually made in 1990 by a West Coast performance artist named Eleanor Anton. And so that right now is our oeuvre, these 3 films. We've been touring them all over the world. We're on our way now to Ljubljana and Pordenone, Italy. And people often, maybe even usually, have never seen a silent film before, or they think a silent film is like people running around weirdly fast and, goofy.
Keystone Cops.
Yeah, and it's so much more than that, because people were as artistic in the 1920s as they were in the 1820s and the 2020s, and as sophisticated. And so great art was made in that format. And then the format died out because of changes in technology, but the acting was different. It wasn't like not evolved yet into what it should be. It was a different medium altogether. And so it's wonderful to see. It's another take on the human condition and experience and the inner life of people. Music for silent films is utterly different than film scores, which, people love film scores. It's a different art because that's underscore, there's dialogue. But what we do is practically like in length. A symphony will play for 2 hours and 15 minutes without pause. And the music is really developed, I have the joy of bringing in my Klezmer melodies that I write and then having Donnie slice and dice them and make a elaborate, complex, sophisticated musical composition out of them, which, on the order of fugues and, like something high art. So we love doing these performances, and we're doing them everywhere. You can go on our websites to get the schedule. And we promise that even for people who, have a hard time without colors in movies or, without dialogue, these will be revelations.
Yeah, we showed City Without Jews to a college audience, well, a couple of college audiences, one at SUNY Binghamton in the fall, and then at Clark University in Worcester, Mass. the other day. And the kids came up to us and said they had a fabulous time. It's not about whether it's black and white and whether there's no sound. It's just a way of connecting so deeply with the past, looking at something from 100 years ago and see, oh, this is still relevant today. I mean, people still read Moby Dick. People still read The Scarlet Letter. So why should films be any different?
Especially after the pandemic, this is an immersive, multimedia, live experience in a room full of people on a big screen with big sound happening. And so especially now in 2023, it's nourishing for the soul, for us and for the audience.
I'd like to also mention that there are recordings of all of three of these films. The Ancient Law and City Without Jews are available on the Flickr Alley label. You can go to flickralley.com or pick them up at one of our live events. And Man Without a World is available from Kino Lorber productions. And we have a couple of other films in the pipeline, which we're not allowed to talk about yet, but those will be quite interesting when we get to them.
And we're grateful to the Sunrise Foundation for Education and the Arts and their chief, Cynthia Walk, a film scholar herself, for supporting these film restorations, the compositions of the scores, the recordings, the performances.
Well, Donnie and Alicia, thank you so much for talking with me and for putting this into the world. It's really rich and beautiful and powerful.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Baruch. Thanks for inviting us.
Alicia Svigals, Donald Sosin, thank you so much for talking with me about the music you're creating and the project of making this music for silent films, especially silent films about the ways Jews were treated, speak so much to what's happening right now in the world. People are oppressed for their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, their economic class. These are all stories about humanity and how we treat each other. Sometimes art brings painful messages as well as beautiful ones. The music is powerful. The message is powerful. I hope you'll check out these films. You can learn more about Alicia Svigals at her website, aliciasvigals.com, ALICIASVIGALS.com. And Donald Sosin's website is oldmoviemusic.com. I hope you'll check them both out. Look into the films. If you're in New York on April 18th, you can attend one of their performances of City Without Jews. Imagine whatever you are, whatever ethnicity you are, whatever your beliefs are, whatever demographic groups you fall into. Imagine everyone who's like you being kicked out of your town. What would that be like? It did happen in Vienna. It's a time for humanity to really learn from our past so we don't keep repeating it. So Donald, Alicia, thank you so much for what you're doing, and it was a real pleasure to meet you both. And if you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms, I hope you'll check out our archive at the website, paradigms.life. We've got all 14 years worth of episodes there. And you can find Paradigms wherever you find your podcasts. If Paradigms isn't being broadcast on one of your local community radio stations, maybe you can let them know that you'd like to hear Paradigms on the radio. We're going to close out the show with a couple more tracks from City Without Jews, music composed and performed by Alicia Svigals and Donald Sosin. And I'm going to leave you with a word for the week, as I always do, and this week the word is compassion. Practice compassion for yourself, for everyone else, for all living things, and let's learn from the past. All right. Baruch signing off for this episode of Paradigms. We'll be back next time with more inspiring people. Until then, let's practice compassion and learn from our experiences. All right. See you next time. Be well. been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.